It is easy to imagine that to analyze your Sage 50 sales data in Microsoft Power BI is as simple as bringing in your sales invoice data and then slicing it by whatever attribute you want, whether it's by customer or analysis period or product or location or any other attribute or attributes that you have in your sales invoices. Well, most of the time this is true. Most of the time it is as simple as that. But there are some exceptions. In this video, we're going to take a look at 10 scenarios to consider when analyzing your sales data from Sage 50 accounts. 10 scenarios where you need to be a little bit more careful and understand how Sage 50 is storing your sales invoice data, how you're currently processing sales invoices in Sage 50, and the kind of an analysis you're trying to achieve. So to start off with, let's take a look at where Sage 50 stores your sales invoice data. There are two main areas within Sage 50 where your sales invoices are stored. In an area that I call the Invoice Tables and in an area that I call the Audit Tables. Now, within your Sage 50 screen, the Invoice Tables appear as your invoices and credits list. In ODBC terms, they're called Invoice and Invoice Item. And in the Cintiq BI data feed for Sage 50, they appear as a table called Sales Invoices and Sales Invoice Details. The other set of invoice data within Sage 50 are what I call the Audit Tables, and in Sage 50, this appears as your transactions list within Sage 50. In ODBC terms, these two tables are called the Audit Header and Audit Split. And within my Cintiq BI dataset here on the right, they're combined and called the transaction details. There's a third area where Sage 50 stores some very useful information, particularly if you want to analyze gross margin for product sales, and that's the stock transactions table. And within Sage 50, you find that in products and services under activity, and in ODBC terms, it's called stock tran, and in my Cintiq BI data feed, it's called stock transactions. So that's where Sage 50 stores your sales invoice data. And the important thing to understand is that the data stored in your invoice tables and the data stored in your audit tables, although at a business level they refer to the same invoices, at a technical level this data is unrelated. So taking a look at these 10 scenarios where perhaps you need to take a little bit of care, what I'm going to look at first is the areas where you must use the audit tables. Otherwise, you will get the wrong results. Okay, so we're going to take a look at 5 scenarios there where you must use the audit tables. And if we take, for example, the customer table, and if I click on here, Batch Invoice tab, I'm presented with a screen where I can very quickly post lots and lots of invoices into Sage 50. And the thing to understand is if you use this Batch Customer Invoice module to create invoices within Sage 50, those invoices do not appear in this invoices and credits list. They just go straight to the audit transactions. Now, what this means, obviously, is if you're using batch sales invoice processing within Sage 50, then you must perform your analysis of the audit and transactions list. A similar scenario applies if you import sales invoices into Sage 50. And this might be, say, for example, you're trading through an e-commerce system, and that e-commerce system produces a CSV file of your day's sales, and you import those sales into Sage 50. Again, if we take a look at Sage 50 and we look at the file, if you're using this capability within Sage 50 for data import, actually what that's doing is that's importing low-level transactions straight into the transactions log within Sage 50, and it bypasses the sales invoices module. So again, anything brought in through a CSV import in terms of sales invoices will not appear in this invoices and credits list. So what that means in Power BI, if you're doing this as part of your business, then it is that those audit transactions, or in the Centico BI data feed, we call it the transaction details. This is where you need to drive your sales analysis, and not from the sales invoices list, because those invoices won't be there. The next area where you must use the audit tables, or these transaction details, this transactions details table, is if you're doing nominal sales analysis. And I suppose this is obvious, but I suppose the simple technical reason behind this is that although the nominal code is carried on an invoice all the way through its journey, from the time you create the invoice through to the time that it's posted, even after it's posted in your transactions list, it is possible to edit. If I just pull up an example here of a sales invoice. This sales invoice has a nominal code of 4,000, but it is possible to edit that nominal code of any of these particular line items. And I can change that nominal code to say 4001 if I wanted. So the very fact that you can change the nominal code at a transaction level within Sage 50 means that if you're performing not sales analysis by nominal code, you have to drive that off your transactions table. And driving it off any other data may produce incorrect results. The fourth area to consider is how you handle errors in your sales invoices. Now, if you're using the sales invoices module to enter and create customer sales invoices, the correct way to handle an error is then to issue a credit note against the erroneous invoice. However, it is possible to delete a sales invoice within the transactions list. Let's take this item number here, reference number 67, which would be invoice number 67. And if we choose to delete that record here, reference number 67, and I delete. That appears in my transactions table as a deleted record, but the record remains within my invoices list. And a fifth area where you must use the audit tables is where you're wanting to perform receivables analysis. And the very simple reason for that is because it is in the transactions table that it holds the outstanding balance against every single invoice. And if you have that, then you can perform this kind of receivables analysis that we're looking at here, where you're looking at the amount outstanding against any particular invoice, then summed by customer, and the amount overdue, and you can calculate the overdue based on the date of the invoice, and so on. These kind of calculations are only possible from the transactions table because the information of the outstanding balance on every single invoice is only present in there. It's not present in the invoices table. Now, you might ask, if the transactions table contains the ultimate final reckoning place for every single sales transaction, why do we not insist that we always use the audit tables for driving sales analysis? And the simple answer for that is that the audit tables don't contain all the information that you may want to analyze. So let's take a look at 4 scenarios where you cannot use the audit tables. And the first is if you wanted to perform product sales analysis. And the simple reason for this is that your transactions table does not contain any product information. So if you're wanting to do this kind of analysis, this is an analysis of sales over the last 28 days. And it's presented as sales by product, sales by customer, by sales rep. And we drill down on this particular chart, we can drill down to sales surprises by product over the last 28 days. What products have we sold more than we expected of? What products have we sold less than we expected of? This information is not in the audit log. It's not in the transactions table. Therefore, you would never be able to drive this kind of analysis of your transactions table. It can only be done by driving your analysis of the sales invoices and sales invoice details tables. A second example where you cannot use the audit tables is if you're trying to drive product gross margin analysis. And this is actually where the stock transactions table comes in handy, because it is the stock transactions table that actually gives you the historic cost price and the selling price of every stock shipment that leaves your warehouse. So it's one thing being able to look up Sage 50 and look up the current cost price of a product and calculate the margin of that. But if you're trying to do historic sales analysis and historic margin analysis, you need the historic cost price of the product. And it's this table that delivers that. And this can be referenced in to your other tables through the stock code. And again, you can't do that with the transactions table, but you can with the sales invoices tables. Here we have a chart showing sales this year, sales last year, and we're showing the margin trends this year versus last year. If you're trying to display charts like this with historic margin calculations, you need access to those historic cost prices, and those are in the stock transactions table, and then you have to drive your analysis off your sales invoice tables and not your audit tables. Also, your invoice fields, your Sage 50 sales invoice fields, if we take a look at some of these, contain additional information that are there for analysis. So sales invoices contain these analysis 1, analysis 2, and analysis 3 fields, which are custom fields designed specifically for you to perform analysis. And if you're using those to analyze your sales invoices, then you have to drive your analysis off your sales invoices tables and not off the audit tables, because these analysis fields do not appear in the audit tables. And finally, a slightly more obscure scenario where you cannot use the audit tables is if for whatever reason you want to analyze unposted sales invoices. And this might be related to a business practice you have of forward dating but not posting invoices, or doing pro forma invoices and so on. And if for whatever reason you wanted to analyze unposted sales invoices, then again, by definition, you cannot use the audit tables, because the audit tables will only include posted sales invoices. So far we've seen 5 scenarios where if you want to do sales analysis, you must use the audit tables. We've looked at 4 scenarios where you cannot use the audit tables. And then we're going to look at a final example where it depends. And this goes back to a previous video we had where we talked about departmental sales analysis. And I'm not going to go into details on that in this video, but if you can recall, if you're doing departmental sales analysis, you can set up your Sage 50 departments in two different ways. You can use it one way to group transactions together, and these can be transactions of different types. They can include journal debits, journal credits, sales invoices, sales credits, purchase invoices, all together in one department, in which case you must drive your analysis off your transactions table or your audit tables. Alternatively, you may simply be using departments as a way of grouping customers or grouping products or grouping suppliers as an additional attribute to those entities, in which case you're given a lot more scope in terms of what tables you drive your sales analysis from. The exception being products, because they're in your transactions table, although you have customer information through your account reference, you do not have product information. So if you're wanting to do departmental sales analysis where you're using departments to group products together, then you will have to use the sales invoices table. So there are a number of things to consider there. And I suppose the important thing to summarize with is that if you always want your analysis to be guaranteed to be numerically financially correct without really thinking about it, then you will need to perform your analysis off the audit tables, what I call the transactions tables, the transaction details here in my Centigo BI data feed, and in ODBC, what you call the audit header and audit split information. But if you limit your sales analysis just to data within this table, then you miss opportunities for perhaps some really useful analysis you might want to do, particularly around products, around margins, and around margins of product sales. You just wouldn't be able to do that analysis if you limit your sales analysis to the audit tables. So by having an understanding of how Sage 50 stores your sales invoice data, whether it stores it and what information it stores in the audit tables, what information it stores in the invoice tables, and how it's related or not, then this will enable you to produce a much more insightful and much deeper analysis of your Sage 50 sales data.